The autumn of 1941 settled over the industrial outskirts of Lille with persistent dampness that penetrated walls and clothing and refused to lift. The canals that threaded through the district carried slow-moving water the color of slate, their surfaces reflecting the gray sky and the silhouettes of warehouses that lined both banks. These structures had been built decades earlier to serve the textile and manufacturing trades, brick buildings with high windows and loading platforms that extended over the water. Many had fallen into disuse even before the occupation began, their interiors emptied of goods and machinery, their doors left unsecured. The war had brought disruption to commerce and transport, leaving portions of the district abandoned except for those who had nowhere else to go. The air carried the smell of stagnant water, coal smoke from distant chimneys, and the faint odor of decay from organic matter accumulating along the canal edges. Mile Karen was 11 years old and had been living in one of these abandoned warehouses since the previous spring. He had arrived in Lille with his mother and younger sister during the chaotic months following the invasion, part of a displaced population moving between cities in search of safety or family. His father had been a soldier and had not returned from the fighting in the north. His mother had found work in a laundry for a time, enough to rent a room in a crowded tenement, but illness had ended her employment, and the rent had gone unpaid. They had been evicted in early summer, and the three of them had moved to the warehouse district where shelter could be found without cost. Miles' mother had grown weaker over the following weeks, her cough persistent and her ability to move limited. His sister, who was 7, had developed a fever in late August and had died within days, her small body buried in an unmarked plot in a cemetery on the edge of the city. His mother had followed 2 weeks later, succumbing to the same illness that had taken the child. Mile had been left alone in the warehouse, one among several dozen people who occupied the building in shifting numbers. The warehouse was a long rectangular structure with a roof that leaked in multiple places and walls that showed gaps where mortar had crumbled. The interior was divided by rows of wooden support columns that had once held shelving and equipment. The floor was concrete, stained and uneven, with puddles forming wherever the roof leaked during rain. Light entered through high windows, many of which had broken panes covered with boards or scraps of metal. The space was occupied by individuals and small groups who had claimed sections using whatever materials they could find to create rudimentary partitions. Mile had established himself in a corner near the back wall, using wooden crates stacked too high to form a low enclosure. Inside this space he had laid down pieces of cardboard and canvas to create a surface that was marginally drier than the bare concrete. He slept on this platform, covered with a wool blanket that had belonged to his mother, and a coat he wore both day and night. The daily routine of survival began at first light. Mile woke cold and stiff, his breath visible in the unheated warehouse. He dressed in layers of warm clothing, pulling on a second pair of pants over the first and wrapping his feet in cloth before putting on boots that were too large and had to be tied tightly to stay on. He left the warehouse through a side door that faced away from the canal, avoiding the main entrance where people gathered and where conflicts sometimes occurred. His destination most mornings was the Central Market District, a 20-minute walk through streets that were largely empty at that hour. The market had been reduced in size and selection due to wartime shortages, but it still operated on a limited schedule, serving the remaining civilian population and supplying provisions for occupation forces. Miles' purpose at the market was not to purchase goods but to scavenge what others discarded. Vendors who sold vegetables and bread often threw away items that were damaged or beginning to rot, piling them in bins behind their stalls or in alleyways near the market's edge. Mile arrived early, before the official market opening, and searched these refuse areas for anything edible. He found potatoes with soft spots that could be cut away, cabbage leaves that were wilted but not spoiled, carrots that were cracked but still firm. He collected these items in a cloth sack he carried folded inside his coat, working quickly and with minimal interaction with others who were engaged in similar activity. Competition for discarded food was constant, and disputes could arise over access to the best scavenging locations. The food he gathered was brought back to the warehouse and stored in a hiding place he had created by prying up a section of loose floorboard near his sleeping area. He kept the food concealed because theft was common among the warehouse occupants, and because revealing that he had supplies would create expectations that he would share. He had learned through observation that those who shared their resources ran out more quickly and were left dependent on others who did not reciprocate. He ate alone, usually after dark when the warehouse had settled and when his movements would be less visible. He would take a potato or a piece of bread from his hidden cache and eat it slowly, chewing thoroughly to make the small portion last. Water came from the canal, drawn in a metal cup and drunk without boiling despite the risk, as he had no reliable means of starting fires. The warehouse population fluctuated between 30 and 50 people depending on the season and the enforcement of occupation regulations. Some were families with children, others were solitary individuals like Mile who had lost their connections. There were elderly people who could no longer work, and younger men who avoided official labor conscription by remaining invisible in places like this. The atmosphere was one of mutual wariness rather than community. People kept to their claimed sections, spoke little, and avoided involvement in the problems of others. Conflicts arose over space, over noise, over access to the limited number of dry areas when rain was heavy. These disputes were usually resolved through intimidation or withdrawal, rarely through outright violence, as no one wanted to attract the attention of authorities who might clear the building entirely. Hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. The canal water was too cold for bathing, and Mile washed his hands and face only when absolutely necessary, using water he collected in his cup. His clothing grew progressively dirtier, the fabric stiff with grime and sweat. Lice became a persistent problem, not just for him but for most of the warehouse occupants. He could feel them moving in his hair and clothing, and the itching was constant. He tried to control the infestation by removing his outer layers and shaking them vigorously, and by running his fingers through his hair to crush any insects he could find, but these efforts provided only temporary relief. The presence of rats added to the discomfort. They moved through the warehouse at night, scurrying along the walls and investigating any area where food might be present. Mile had elevated his sleeping platform on the crates specifically to reduce the chance of rats climbing onto him while he slept. As autumn progressed into the colder months, the warehouse became more crowded. People who had been sleeping outdoors or in less substantial shelters sought indoor spaces as temperatures dropped and rain became more frequent. The newcomers claimed whatever space they could find, sometimes pushing into areas that had been loosely held by earlier occupants. Miles' corner remained relatively secure because it was in a less desirable part of the building, away from the few functioning windows and in an area where the roof leaked badly. He had positioned his platform to avoid the worst of the drips, and he tolerated the dampness in exchange for being left alone. The increased population brought new tensions. Arguments over waste disposal became common, as the makeshift latrine area in one corner of the warehouse could not accommodate the increased use. The smell worsened, and some people began relieving themselves in other parts of the building, creating unsanitary conditions that spread. The lice infestation intensified, visible now on the clothing and bedding of nearly everyone. People scratched constantly, their skin marked with red welts and sores from the irritation. The lack of adequate food meant that resistance to illness was low, and coughs and fevers circulated through the population. Mile watched as an older man who slept near the main entrance grew progressively sicker over the course of a week, his coughing fits keeping others awake at night. The man eventually stopped moving, and his body was removed by other occupants who dragged it to the canal edge and left it for authorities to collect. The requisition happened on a cold morning in late November. Mile woke to the sound of voices and heavy footsteps echoing through the warehouse. He peered over the edge of his crate enclosure and saw uniformed men moving through the space, accompanied by civilian workers carrying clipboards and measuring equipment. The men were conducting an inspection, examining the structure and making notes. One of them, who appeared to be in charge, was issuing instructions in German to the others. The warehouse occupants watched in silence, understanding that their presence was being officially acknowledged for the first time in months, and that this likely meant displacement. The inspection continued for over an hour. The men measured floor space, checked the condition of the walls and roof, and tested the loading doors that opened onto the canal. They paid no attention to the people living there, treating them as if they were simply part of the building's clutter. When the inspection concluded, the man in charge addressed the occupants in accented French, informing them that the warehouse was being requisitioned for storage purposes and that all civilians must vacate within 24 hours. Anyone remaining after that time would be subject to arrest and relocation to a labor camp. The announcement was delivered without emotion or opportunity for response. The uniformed men left, and the civilian workers began marking sections of the floor with chalk, designating areas for different types of storage. The reaction among the warehouse occupants was muted. Most had experienced displacement before and understood that resistance was futile. People began gathering their belongings, the process revealing how little most of them owned. Miles dismantled his crate shelter and retrieved his hidden food supply, wrapping the items in his blanket and tying the bundle with rope. He watched as others packed similar bundles or simply walked away with nothing, having accumulated no possessions during their time in the warehouse. Families with children moved first, seeking alternative shelter before the best options were claimed. The solitary individuals moved more slowly, having fewer immediate concerns and less urgency. Miles left the warehouse in the early afternoon, carrying his bundle and wearing every piece of clothing he owned. He had no destination in mind beyond finding another sheltered space before nightfall. He walked along the canal, checking other warehouses in the district. Most were either occupied already or had been secured with locks and guards. He expanded his search to include ruined buildings farther from the canal, structures that had been damaged during the invasion and never repaired. He found a partially collapsed house with an intact cellar, accessible through a gap in the foundation wall. The cellar was small and completely dark, but it was dry and protected from wind. He crawled inside and arranged his belongings in a corner, using his blanket to create a barrier between himself and the cold stone floor. The cellar became his shelter for the next several weeks, but it was less satisfactory than the warehouse had been. The complete darkness during the hours he spent inside was disorienting, and the confined space made movement difficult. He could not stand upright, and entering or exiting required crawling through the narrow opening. The isolation was more pronounced, as there were no other people nearby and no ambient sounds to indicate activity or danger. He continued his routine of scavenging at the market, but the distances he had to walk increased, and the energy expenditure reduced the net value of what he found. Winter arrived with freezing temperatures and occasional snow. The cellar offered protection from precipitation but not from cold, and Miles spent the nights shivering beneath his blanket, unable to generate enough warmth to sleep comfortably. He began spending more time during the day searching for fuel, gathering scraps of wood and coal to attempt fires in sheltered locations where the light and smoke would not be easily visible. These fires were small and short-lived, but they allowed him to warm his hands and occasionally heat food. The effort required to maintain this routine grew more demanding as his physical condition deteriorated from inadequate nutrition and constant exposure to cold. The war continued in the background, its presence felt through the movement of military vehicles, the sound of distant explosions, and the periodic enforcement actions that cleared certain areas of civilian presence. Miles avoided interaction with occupation forces and with the few remaining French authorities, understanding that official attention meant either forced labor assignment or confinement. He moved through the city's margins, becoming adept at remaining unnoticed and at finding routes that avoided checkpoints and patrol patterns. The liberation of the area came in the autumn of 1944, though the immediate aftermath brought little improvement to Miles' situation. The fighting that accompanied the change in control damaged additional buildings and disrupted what little remained of civilian infrastructure. Food shortages persisted, and the chaos of transition created new dangers. Miles survived by continuing his established patterns, scavenging and hiding and moving between temporary shelters. He was eventually identified by relief workers who were attempting to locate unaccompanied children in the months following the liberation. He was taken to a temporary facility that provided basic care and attempted to trace family connections. No relatives were found, and he was placed in an orphanage operated by a charitable organization. Mile remained in institutional care until he was 15, receiving basic education and vocational training. He learned carpentry and showed aptitude for practical work that required precision and patience. He was apprenticed to a furniture maker and continued in that trade after completing his training. He worked steadily, saving money and maintaining a solitary lifestyle. He married in his late 20s to a woman he met through his employer, and they had 2 children. The family lived in a small house on the outskirts of Lille, not far from the Canal district where Mile had spent those years during the war. He spoke rarely about that period, offering only minimal information when his children asked about his childhood. The memories remained vivid but were kept private, not because they were too painful to share but because they existed in a separate category from the life he had built. He avoided waste in all forms, saving food scraps and reusing materials in ways that sometimes puzzled his family. He maintained a small pantry stocked well beyond immediate need, a habit formed during years when the availability of food had been uncertain and survival had depended on hidden reserves. Mile worked as a carpenter for 4 decades, eventually opening his own small workshop where he produced custom furniture and repairs. He approached the work with meticulous attention to detail and an insistence on durability, building pieces that would last for generations. He retired in his 60s and spent his remaining years tending a vegetable garden and volunteering at a local community center that provided meals for those experiencing hardship. He died in 2003, leaving behind children and grandchildren who knew only that he had been orphaned during the war and had survived through resourcefulness and self-reliance. The specifics of those years, the cold cellar and the hidden food and the constant calculation of risk and resource, were not recorded and passed from memory with him. They had been the foundation of a life shaped by necessity, carried forward in habits and values that persisted long after the immediate circumstances that created them had faded into history.